Today's daf is daf Chav Vav, the beginning of the fourth parak. Shlosha prakim on three different zmanim b'shana during the course of the year. Hakohanim nosim es kapeim arba piyamim biyom. There will be nesias kapayim birchas kohanim 4 times a day. Shachris b'musaf b'mincha b'ne'ilas she'orim. These are days apparently that they add an extra tefillah above and beyond musaf. They also add a tefillah of ne'ilah, a tosefes tefillah. And in all these 4 tefillos, there will be nesias kapayim. And now the Mishnah tells us what are these 3 prakim that Moshe prakim: b'tainios, ubemamados, uviyom kippur. So the minig was to be mispal tefillas ne'ilah every tainus, just like they did on Yom Kippur. Mabodos are the 4 days in the week, starting from Monday, ending on Thursday, when the Anshe Maimon would fast, as we'll see in the Mishnah as we go along. And also on those days, they would add tefillas ne'ilah. And of course, on Yom Kippur, the Gemara later on is going to ask, in Taanit Mabodos, there is no tefillas musaf. And here we're talking about Bishlosha Prakim Bashana Nosim, Kohanim Nosim is Kapem Arba Pamim Biyom. And in order to calculate Arba Pam, you have to add Musaf. And on Tainios and Mamodos, there is no Tefillas Musaf. The Gemara is going to ask that question, and there's going to be a Chisuri Mechsera, and we're going to sort of rewrite and formulate the Mishnah. Elu Hein Mamodos. The Mishnah is asking a rhetorical question. What are the Mamodos? We talk about Mamodos, and we're speaking about Shlosha Prakim B'Shana. Amongst them are Maimodos. What are the Maimodos? What's it all about? Shenemar, with regard to Korban Taanit, the Torah says at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, Sav es b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alihem es karbani lachmi l'shayrech v'chochit yishpul ha'akav li b'moado. So we're going to emphasize now the beginning of that pasuk and then later the end of the pasuk. The beginning of the pasuk says, Sav es b'nei Yisrael, to teach us that all of b'nei Yisrael have a part in the Tmidim, in the Korban Taanit shel Shachar, Taanit shel Ben Arbaim. And these Tmidim were purchased from the monies of the Chatzi Shekel, the Masechet Shekel, that all of the people of Israel would contribute. So included in this obligation of Tzavis B'nai Yisrael is the giving of the Masechet Shekel and gaining, in a sense, a chelik, a partnership in the Taanit on every member of Klal. So that's a Korban Tzibur. However, at the end of the pasuk, it says Tishmeru, Lahakiv Li B'Moado, and Tishmeru means, and this is the Sifri in Parshas Pinchas, Shechayev Adam Lamed Al Karbana. A person, when he brings a carbon, he has to stand over his carbon, Lishmar Olav B'Shashu Kare, and he has to stand over the carbon. Now, if all of Israel are obligated in the Korban Taanit, that means all of Israel, every last member of Klal Yisrael has to stand on the Korban Taanit. It's the carbon of everyone. And that's impossible. You can't engineer it that all of Klal Yisrael enter in to the Mikdash and be Shomer and be Omed al Karbonim. And therefore, his Kinu Nevi'im HaRishonim, and this is Shmuel and David, the early Nevi'im established that Esrim B'Arba Mishmaros, they'll call Mishmar of Mishmar, Mamad, Yerushalayim Shal Kohanim Shal Vim Shal Yisrael. So the number 24 here has a mirror image of parallel 2 times 24. There's 24 Maros of Kohanim, and they divided up the Kohanim who were voted into 24 different Mishmaros, different groups. Every Mishmar, every single group would serve in the Beis Mikdash a full week, and then they would be replaced by the next Mishmar, the oncoming Mishmar. And Keneged, corresponding to all these 24 Mishmaros of Kohanim, there were Mishmaros which were called Mamodos. And these Mamodos were made up of members of Klal Yisrael who would represent the entire tzibur of Klal Yisrael. So they were, in a sense, the shluchim of Klal Yisrael, to stand over the korbanos to the kind of mitzvah Tishma. And Klal Yisrael were divided up into 24 Ma'amados, as we said before, parallel to the 24 Mishmaros of Kahuna. And those Anshe Ma'amad, if they lived on a permanent basis in Yerushalayim, they would be omid on the carbon of their brothers as a shlichus. And in that way, was considered as if all of Klal Yisrael was standing over the carbon because of the principle established by the Gemara in Kedushin, shlichus shel adam kimoso. He writes here that the Gemara later on seems to indicate that the Anshe Mishmar were not in Yerushalayim, were also called Anshe Mishmar, and they wouldn't necessarily come into Yerushalayim. They would have their Ma'amados outside Yerushalayim in their respective cities, as Amir Tzshem will see as we go along. Higiazman Mishmar Lalos, Kohanim Levim, Olim Liyushalayim, Yisrael Sheba also Mishmar Miskansim Le'arehem. So the members of that Mishmar of Kohanim and Levim would come from all the cities that dotted the land of Israel and came up to Yerushalayim, the Kohanim for Avodah, Levim for Shir, and the Anshe Ma'amad who lived in Yerushalayim on a permanent basis would stand over the carbon of their brothers. Yisrael Sheba also Mishmar. Mishmar here means Maimon, and they didn't live in Yerushalayim. Then they would gather together in their cities, and they had what we call a Richus Tefillah. They would be mispal on the carbon of their brothers, that it should be received with the will of Hashem B'Rotza. And during that week of the Maimon, the Anshe Maimon would fast. They would take out Sifrei Torah every day. And as we said before, there'd be an arichus of tefillah. The Korim, the Maisa Bereshis. They would read the Torah in that week of fasting of Ma'amados, and they would read the parasha of the creation of the world to emphasize the world exists in the merit of the avodah that is being done in the Beis HaMikdash, as we'll see in the Gemara later on in Chav Zayin. It comes out now that besides the Maimon that took place in Yerushalayim, there were Ma'amados in every single city in Israel, and the Anshe Maimon would fast on the specific days. We'll see about the 4 days in a minute. They would gather together for Tefillah Shacharis, Mincha, Une'ilah on every day of the days of Mammon. They would be Marach B'Tefillah, B'Tchina, Ubakasha al Karban Achim Sheiskablu B'Rotz. The Korim B'Torah L'Fi Seder, and we'll see the Seder in a minute. Anshe Ma'amad Hayu Mis'anim Arba Yom B'Shavua Yom Sheni Ad Yom Chamishis, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, to the exclusion of Sunday and Friday. V'lo Yom Mis'anim B'Erev Shabbos. Why not on Friday? Why was that excluded from Taanit? B'nei Kvod Shabbos, that a person shouldn't come into Shabbos when he's in the state of Inui. And how much more so that he shouldn't fast on Shabbos itself. V'lo bi'echad Shabbos. Why not on Sunday? Why no fasting on Sunday? Kedei shelo yetzu mimenucha v'oneg liyagia v'tainis v'amusa. It's dangerous to go from a state of oneg. You've been feeding your neshama yisera lots of food on Shabbos, and now you go into a state of yigia and tainis. That's too much. It's going to weaken the body. Now we go through the Seder Kriyas HaParshas during the course of the week of the Ma'amados. Yom Rishon on the first day of the week, they would read 2 parshas, Bereshis and Yehirakia. When we say 2 parshas, actually Bereshis begins the Torah, of course, and when you get to Vayerev Vayivoki Yom Echad, you've already read the first 5 psukim of the first chapter of Bereshis, and the 6th, 7th, and 8th psukim are Yehirakia. So it means that Parshas Bereshis Levada, where we described the Ma'aseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the first day of the Bria, it doesn't have 9 psukim. We need 9 psukim because we need 3 kruim, Kohen, Levi, Israel, and each one has to get a minimum of 3 psukim to read. So you need all told 9 psukim. And therefore, they have to add to the kriya of the first 5 psukim that begins with Beishas Bar Elokim and ends with Vayer Vayvoki Yom Echad. That would only comprise 5 psukim. They needed a minimum of 9 psukim. So therefore, they added Yehira Kia, which really describes the creation of the second day of the 6 days of creation. And on each successive day, they would add to read the Parashas Hayom Shaliach. B'Sheni, on a Monday, they would read Yehira Kia, which again, they read Yehira Kia already on the first day, but there it was secondary, now it becomes primary. Uyikavu Amayim. The Yehira Kia, we said, was Psukim Vav, Zayin, and Ches, and he adds now Tes, Yud, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Yikavu Amayim. Shlishi, Yikavu Amayim. Again, he begins with the end of the Kriya of the previous day, because that was only an add-on on the previous day. It wasn't the Ikar Kriya, it was only there to be matched with the number 9. And then, after Yikavu Amayim, which he now needs other psukim to be matched to 9 so that he can call up 3 korim, is Vayehi Ma'oros. And those are the psukim Yudalit until Tespa. Uravi, Yehi Ma'oros, V'yishu to Amayim. Psukim Chaf to Chav Gimel. V'chamishi, Yishu to Amayim V'totzei Ha'oretz. And V'shishi, Totzei Ha'oretz, and Vayechudu Hashamayim. Now, there are 2 units in each one of these kriyos. And yet we have to call up 3 kriyot. So how do we manage that? So the Mishnah continues, addressing this question. It says, Parsha Gedola, of these 2 paragraphs, there was one that was longer than the other. And what they would do with the longer one is Kardas of Shnayim. They would divide up to 2 kriyot. Now, even if there are only 5 psukim out of the 9 in that larger paragraph, that larger unit, so how do you get 2 kriyot with 5 psukim? The answer is they would repeat one of the psukim. So you'd have 3 and 3. The Ketana. What about the second paragraph, which could be the first paragraph? One of the paragraphs which is smaller, the Yachid. We'll take, for example, on Sunday, the first day of the week, they read Parshas Bereishis. That's 5 psukim, and they would call it 2 kruim. And then it was the smaller parsha, which is called Yehira Kia, and there were only 3 psukim, and they would call up 1 person. And together, what you have is 3 kruim. Why? Because you have 2 kruim for the first 5 psukim, and another person who read Yehira Kia, which was only 3 psukim. But all told, we have 9 psukim and 3 kruim. Let's give another example. On a Monday, they would read Yehira Kia. And Yehira Kia is the shorter of the 2 units, so there would be only 1 aliyah, 1 karu. And then they went on to Yikavu Amayim, which has 5 psukim, and they would call 2 kruim to the Torah. On Yom Shlishi, they would read the parasha of Yikavu Amayim, which is a shorter parasha, with 1 karu. And then Yehima Oros has 6 psukim. That they would split into 2 in a very smooth way, 3 psukim for each karu. And the Gemara later on is going to explain the machlokes, the chiluk of the parasha, the machalkin parasha. And how do you divide up a parasha which has 5 psukim into 2 korim, and which pasuk you might repeat, and so forth. Now, I see that Elliot joined us, so I just want to mention where we're up to. We're up to Daf Avav, and we'll start with B'Shachis. And this is one of the longest Mishnayos in Shas. Really a long, long Mishnah. So we're up to the Shacharis, which is approximately, I would say, maybe 10 lines up from the bottom of the Amud, and the first word in the line is B'Shachris. So later on, I'm going to ask Elliot if he's going to join us or what his plans are. Right now, I don't know. You know, the thing about Zoom is that sometimes you just see a name on the Zoom. You don't know who it is. You can only identify the name. And you don't know if there's a person there or not. That's the tricky thing about Zoom. Unless the person is bold enough and kind enough and sympathetic enough to open up its camera so that you can make eye contact. The Shachris, they took out the Sefer Torah to read the way that we described it, the various psukim. Oh, there you are. How are you? Okay, good. So you let me know what your schedule is. You know, I didn't really know if you were coming today. And, you know, I could schedule the timing to work it out with you. There are two of our members who are now in Chutz La'aretz. Okay. So on Shachris, they took a Sefer Torah to read it Keseder. And this is the Seder they read, even on Musaf. So we're talking about the Mamados. And on certain cases, the Anshe Mamad would be Mispalel Musaf. Like, for example, Rosh Chodesh has its own Karban Musaf and its own Tfilas Musaf. In Mincha, they didn't take out a Sefer Torah. Why? Because by the time it was Mincha time, in the afternoon, they were very exhausted from the fast. And therefore, Chazal spared them the extra burden of reading the Torah, that extra tircha. But rather, Nichnasim, they would go into the Beis HaKnesses, this is very fascinating, V'korin al piyah, Kikorin Eshma. There was no official Kriyas Torah in public with a tzibur of Asara from a Sefer, but rather each individual would read that section of the Torah on his own, Baal Peh, without a Sefer. And this is exactly like Kriyat Shema, where Kriyat Shema, you don't have to read it mitoch ha-Sefer, you don't have to open up a Sefer Torah and recite Kriyat Shema. You can be yotzei Kriyat Shema by reading it by heart. And with regard to Ne'ilah, they wouldn't read at all from the parasha, not even Baal Peh, even in private. Erev Shabbos b'mincha lo hayu nichnasim mipnei kvod Shabbos. They didn't come into the Beis HaKnesses to read the parasha, even Baal Peh, because of kvod Shabbos. Because immediately after mincha, they davened the early mincha on Erev Shabbos. They would be free to be osek in Tzarchei Shabbos, and therefore they would not be burdened by having to read the parasha neither b'tzibur mitoch ha-Sefer nor b'yachid Baal Peh. Now the Mishnah wants to clarify those times, the Zmanim, when the Maimon, which would gather the assembly of the people with an Arichas Tefillah, would be bought. Kol Yom Sheish Bo Halel. It means there's a day in which you recite Hal, but there's no Musaf. And there's only one such unit of time during the calendar, the Hebrew calendar year, in which there is a Tfilas Halel, but without a Tfilas Musaf. Very rare, and that's only Chanukah. And Ein Bo Maimed B'Shachris, the Anshi Maimed, who are situated, as we said earlier, in Yerushalayim, would not gather together for Shachris with Arichas Tefillah on the Karban, because they have to read the Hallel, and they don't have time for Arichas Tefillah to extend that Tefillah. They would just recite a short tefillah to Hashem that he should accept the korban, the ratzon, and they would be occupied with the reading of Hallel. And it seems clear from this Mishnah that Hallel is doche maimon. However, that's only as far as Shacharis is concerned, because Hallel was recited, integrated into Shacharis. But Mincha, Ne'ilah had maimon. It was an arichas tefillah because they were not preoccupied with the reading of Hallel. Now we have the day, which is a day of Karban Musaf, and that would be Rosh Chodesh, is ein, there's no Maimed. Again, Maimed meaning Arichas HaTfilah, for those Anshe Maimed who lived in Yerushalayim, B'ne'ilah. And if in the Ilah there was no Maimed, then how much more so there was no Maimed and Arichas Tfilah in Mincha. And why is that? Because it seems, as Rashi elaborates on it, is that the Karban Musaf was a very complicated business. It required a minimum of 2 animals, and sometimes even more than 2 animals. It wasn't like the regular Karban Taanit, which was 1 animal. And even though Yisraelim who are not Kohanim, they can't be makriv, but nevertheless, they have to be preoccupied with other aspects, other dimensions. For example, chativas, ha'etzim, she'ivas, hamayim. There were many other jobs that were imposed upon the shoulders of the Israelim. And therefore, there was no time, free time for arichas tefillah b'ne'ilah. So even though ne'ilah is at the end of the day, and it does not represent or correspond to any karma, but nevertheless there would be no mamados on a day of Karban Musaf, even in the Ilu. How much more so that there wouldn't be Maimon in Tfilas Mincha, which is right near the Karban Musaf. Now the Mishnah goes on to discuss a different kind of a Karban, which is called a Karban Eitz. And there are 9 days in the calendar year that was set, in which certain families, we'll mention them by name as we go along, would bring a contribution to the Mikdash, Eitzim. And the volume of logs that was brought during these 9 days was meant to last a long, long time. And when the people of Israel would contribute Eitzim, and we'll see which mishpachos, which families did so, they would bring a korban. That was a korban in double, a voluntary korban. Not only that, the day was commemorated as a yom tov. It was so exciting. This was their opportunity to contribute the Eitzim. And therefore, there's no maimon b'mincha, because they brought the korban Eitzim right before mincha, and the korban is dochel the maimon. Again, there's no dechi of ne'ilah here, mind you. It's only mincha. As we said before, because they brought the korban Eitzim right before mincha. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. And we'll soon see that Rabbi Akiva ultimately changed his mind. Amalo Ben Azai turns to Rabbi Akiva, he says, Kacha Rabbi Yishmael Shoneh. This is what we learned from Rabbi Yoshua, the earlier Tana, Karban Musaf, a day in which we bring a Karban Musaf. Ein b'mincha, there's no maimon in mincha, which is right before the Karban Musaf. And how much more so, there was no maimon in Tfilas Musaf, because that's when they were busy, preoccupied with the Karban Musaf. However, there would be Maimed Shacharis time and also Ne'ilah time. And Karban Eitzim, just the opposite. Ein bo Maimed b'Ne'ilah, but yesh bo Maimed b'Mincha. The Gemara later on is going to explain the logic that underlies the Shita of Rabbi Yeshua. But when you analyze it, you'll see that Rabbi Yeshua is the exact opposite of Rabbi Akiva with regard to a Karban Eitzim. And according to Ben Azai, in the name of Rabbi Yeshua, the Korban Eitzim has no maimad in Ne'ilah, but it has a maimad in Mincha. And Chazar Rabbi Akiva Leo Shonik Rabbi Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva ultimately retracted his position and accepted that of Ben Azai. Now, what were those days? We said there were 9 days out of the calendar year in which they brought the Korban Eitzim. And there were certain special mishpachos that had the beautiful rights to bring a Korban Eitzim. So Zman Atzei Kohanim Va'am. Now, this is talking about what we call Bayis Sheni. And you know that Ezra came with a group, unfortunately a relatively small group of Jews on Aliyah Shniya to Eretz Yisrael to build the Bayis Sheni. And amongst the chaburos of people who came from the Golus, a little bit after the Beis HaMikdash was built, the second Bayis, they would bring on an annual basis these specific mishpachos of Kohanim and from Yisrael, Eitzim L'Marach. And on that day, they would bring a korban. It was a holiday for them. And Tisha. There are 9 such days. So now we're going to go through the list of the 9 days in the Hebrew calendar in which the Eitzim were brought to the Mikdash and the names of the Mishpachos that respectively brought their Eitzim on those days. All told 9 days. The Echad ben Nisan, or Rosh Chodesh Nisan, who brought the Eitzim? Bnei Arach ben Yehuda, meaning he's from Shevet Yehuda. So it's interesting. You know, the Jewish people are coming now, gathering from the Gola, from the diaspora, and who would be the first family to contribute Eitzim? And that was none other than Arach, a mishpacha that's named Arach, and the members of that family would bring on the 1st of Nisan their contribution of logs for the Marach and the Mizbeach. They were the first. The Esrei B'Tammuz, now we're really fast forwarding by a chunk of time, from Rosh Chodesh Nisan to the 20th of Tammuz, Bnei David ben Yehuda. These are the descendants of David, the Mishpachas David. And they would bring their Korban Eitzim on the 20th of Tammuz. Ben Yehuda, so they were from Shevet Yehuda. And what it means is that if you go back to the first family, that's Bnei Arach, and they brought on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, it seems that they brought their Eitzim consecutively, continuously, from Rosh Chodesh Nisan all the way to the 20th of Tammuz. On the 20th of Tammuz, Bnei Arach handed over the reins to Bnei David. And now, from the 20th of Tammuz, the Bnei David would begin the process of contributing the Eitzim. And of course, the Bnei David were Ben Yehuda, I mean, they were from Shevet Yehuda. So we have Arach, who's from Shevet Yehuda, and they would begin bringing the Eitzim on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And then there were Bnei David, also from Shevet Yehuda. They would take over from the Bnei Arach on the 20th of Tammuz. The Chamisha B'Av, on the 5th of Av, who would bring the Eitzim? Bnei Parosh Melech Yehuda. Some of these names are very, very strange to us. In any event, that was on the 5th of Av. B'Shivabo on the 7th of Av, B'nai Yonadav, Ben Rochav. They came from the B'nai Yisro, Chosei Moshe. And Basarabo on the 10th of Av, B'nai Sna'ah, Ben Binyamin from Shevet Binyamin. B'Chamisha Sarbo on the 15th of Av, B'nai Zatua, Ben Yehuda. Zatu Ben Yehuda. Strange name. Zatu. The Moem, and together with the B'nai Zatu, a number of different groups of people joined like a large chabura to bring Eitzim. There were Kohanim, there were Leviim, V'chol Misha Tov B'Shivta. Interesting. Somebody didn't know which mishpach he came from. And these mishpachos were the Makrivei Eitzim, and he didn't know to which mishpach he belongs. So he would link up as a kind of tag along to the Bnei Zatu. And Bnei Gonvei Eli, Ubnei Kotzei Tzios. These are families in Israel. Those are their names. And the name itself reflects the concept of Mesirus Nafsham Laman Kiyum HaMitzvah. And that's going to be a Gemara later on. So all these individuals would gather together with Bnei Zatu, and we have to point out here, the Meiri makes this a big deal, that the Bnei Zatu were very mu'atim. They were a very small number of members of that family. So in order to beef up that family, they would take those who didn't know which mishpacha they were from, and those who would sort of tag on to the Bnei Zatu. Bnei Zatu, again, was a mishpacha of Mesirus Nefesh. And despite their small numbers, when they showed up for Mamados, they were very, very large group. The Esrimbo on the 20th of Av, Bnei Fachas, Moav, Ben Yehuda. Again, as I said before, the names are really Moav, Achas. Anyway, the Esrim. Now we're fast forwarding to the 20th of Elul. Bnei Adin. No, not Steinsaltz. Adin Ben Yehuda. The Echad B'Teves. Oh, now we get to Rosh Chodesh Teves. That's a special day. Shebo Bnei Parosh. Ben Yehuda would bring Eitzim Shliya a second time around. You remember that Bnei Parosh would bring their Eitzim on the 5th of Av. Now it's Rosh Chodesh Teves, and they bring their Eitzim a second time around. And this is based on the fact that during the time period of Ezra, the Bnei Parosh twice committed themselves to an adava of Eitzim. Now, we said that Rosh Chodesh Teves was very special. Why? Because Rosh Chodesh Teves is also Chanukah. The Echad B'Teves Lo Hoya Bo Mama. There's this whole idea of gathering together the people in an assembly with an Arichas Tefillah. That did not apply on Rosh Chodesh Teves, on any one of the Tefillahs. Why is that? Hoyabo Hallel, on Chanukah we read Hallel, and therefore that's going to be Doch for the Maimed of Chakras, as we saw earlier. The Karban Musaf, that day is not only Chanukah with Hallel, but it's also a day in which we bring a Korban Musaf because the overlap of Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah. And the Korban Musaf, we said before, was Doche, the Maimon of Tfilas Musaf and even of Mincha. And then it says, U Korban Eitzim. So take a look at the three-way overlap on Rosh Chodesh Teves. Number one, there was Hallel. Number two, there was a Korban Musaf because it was Rosh Chodesh. Number three, this was the day in which the Bnei Parish brought their second round of Eitzim. And therefore, there's no Maimon. Why? Because the Hallel is going to trump the Mamados of Shacharis. The Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, right, will trump the Maimon of both Musaf and Mincha. And the Korban Eitzim on that day would trump the Maimon of Ne'ilah. So there was 0 Mamados on one day. So in a quiz question, we would ask a budding scholar, can you tell me what day on the Hebrew calendar year that's not Yom Tov, and there are no Mamados whatsoever? And the answer would be Rosh Chodesh Teves. Now, the next part of the Mishnah, the Taanit dedicates to the laws of what's called the Taanit Tzibur, that's Kavua, and it's said on a certain day. And we begin with the 17th of Tammuz. Chamisha Dvarim Iru Es Avosenu B'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. 5 things, 5 calamities occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. And another 5, Chamisha, B'Tisha B'Av. These are days of Churban Abayis. But nevertheless, there were other tzaros, many other tzaros that occurred on those days. And the Mishnah feels compelled. It's very important for us to know all the terrible calamities that took place, above and beyond those that affected the Mikdash and the Churban. And now we're going to go through the 5 calamities that took place on Shabbos B'Tammuz and the 5 that took place on Tisha B'Av.